Immigration to Western countries was always one of those things polite people didn't talk about. People who did were close-minded, they were bigots, they were racist, the sort of person you'd expect to see down the pub with a shaved head, the sort of person who wanted to leave the EU, the sort of person who liked Enoch Powell. The charge of racist could be bandied around and it silenced any debate. The question became irrelevant as you hopelessly tried to defend yourself from the charge of being racist. To be charged was to be guilty of this most heinous of crimes. Smarter people realized there was no winning this debate, and so they shut up, despite having real concerns. And many politicians of the right did not want to share Enoch Powell's fate. They knew full well of the obvious dangers, but almost without exception, they put self-interest before the national interest. They cowered and pretended multiculturalism was our strength. They pretended not to notice that Notting Hill Carnival was becoming little more than a haven for lawless degeneracy. Hundreds of politicians and police knew full well that young white and Sikh girls were, well, because YouTube is sensitive about certain words, let's say, groomed by immigrants of certain parts of the world. But they said nothing. The absolute cowardice is a permanent and disqualifying stain upon their character and future participation in public life. Edmund Burke, who is regarded as one of the founders of modern conservatism, once famously said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." In this case, some pretty mediocre people did absolutely nothing at all. In the 90s, the right used to pretend they supported immigration for genuine refugees, but not for economic migrants. It's not clear this was anything more than a slogan rather than a policy, but that's what they said. However, when the ever admirable and noble Tony Blair was elected in 1997, he opened the floodgates. Labour advisor Andrew Nether notoriously said, this was a policy devised to rub the right's nose in diversity. That is, to change the UK's ethnic makeup as a taunt to Middle England. Make no mistake, they hate us. In the 13 years that Labour were in office between 1997 and 2010, net migration to the UK by non-Britons totalled over 3 million. The Conservatives, for all their rhetoric, barely changed a thing. Since 2010, net migration to the UK by non-Britons has totalled 2.7 million. In 2019, the non-UK population stood at 9.4 million, and these are ONS figures. To imagine or to pretend this hasn't had a vast impact on almost every area of life in the UK is either foolish or an outright lie. There are obvious issues such as the lack of housing, lack of jobs, hospital capacity, school places, transport facilities, power generation, water supplies, and above all, money to fund all this, along with social and societal dislocation and the collapse of social trust. Yet it's still very difficult to get any politician to talk about this. Those that do are branded racist, fascist, etc. But that's a charge that's starting to lose its meaning due to overuse in the last 30 years. Add to that, the problems are just too significant and too visible to ignore anymore. Sweden, for example, was formerly seen as a haven of peace and tolerance. But for some reason, in the last 30 years, there's been an explosion in violent crime, grenade attacks, and shall we say, non-consensual intimate relations. It's difficult to get stats on the demographic makeup of these criminals because the government stopped keeping them, but sometimes correlation is indeed causation. UK gangs of men who, again I have to be sensitive about certain words, let's say men who like non-consensual relations with girls in their early teens are often referred to as men of Asian origin. If I were a Chinese Buddhist or an Indian Hindu, I might be somewhat aggrieved at this vague categorization. The UK media seem terrified to state the obvious. So, what can be done? Well, first, let's stop pretending immigration is a homogeneous and irreducible concept. Asking someone what they think of immigration is like asking them what they think of food. Some food's sensational, some bland but necessary, and some is poisonous, and so it is with immigration. Who amongst us has a problem with a small number of Korean software engineers coming to the UK? What's the criminal profile of Japanese executives who work for Sony or Toyota, based in the UK or Europe or America? As far as I can find any stats at all, it's virtually zero, and these groups are, of course, net tax contributors. What about, say, building labourers from Ireland? Sure, many of these guys are not intellectuals, but they've got great practical skills that the UK needs. Construction workers in the UK are fairly well paid, so they too are likely to be net tax contributors. Furthermore, neither of these groups believe that they own their wives or are entitled to have compelled physical relations with women of other religions. And it's not necessarily even important to physically resemble the indigenous group, nor share the same religion. Both Hindus and Sikhs have been phenomenally successful immigrants. Their religions are different, sure, their cultural practices are different, but there's no great cultural animus, Neither do they believe their religious book grants them the right to brutalize non-believers. Finally, to some extent, there's a degree of integration. This is important. Cultures that live beside each other but never interact become distrustful and eventually hostile. History is littered with such examples, and this is not a mistake we can ever afford to repeat. None of the mainstream parties are ever going to do anything about this, whatever they might say in their manifesto. We are still more or less a peaceful and democratic society, so it is essential that we stop voting for mainstream parties. This lesser of two evils nonsense has left us run by puppets. Does anyone really think Starmer or Sunak, Biden or Trudeau, or any of the EU puppets have the best interests of their countries at heart? If you still think that, if the events of the past 5 or 6 years haven't disavowed you of that notion, then I wish you the very best of luck. But if you realise the reality of mainstream politicians being entirely bought and paid for, vote for someone else. It's the only way to achieve change. Demonstrations won't do it. Petitions won't do it. And social media posts won't do it. If we want change, we need to vote for change, not more of the same. We have the power. You have the power. Vote for change.